Resident Evil 4
is rightly heralded as one of the most important, most influential, and just one of the best damn games of all time. It's also the most fun way to practice your Spanish. It may be almost 20 years old, but it doesn't feel dated in the slightest, and there are big budget AAA games even today that are still living in its shadow. I don't want to linger too long on this because anybody watching this almost certainly knows all that already, but it should become clear throughout this video exactly what made it such a visionary masterpiece. And anyway, this video isn't about that game, it's about this game, the one released in 2023. In my video on the recent Dead Space remake, I complained that it didn't bring enough new ideas to the table to artistically justify its existence, or its price. Which is why I'm pleased to report that the devs of the Resi 4 remake have made a few changes that prove they weren't afraid to shake up the original template. And on the whole, the results are overwhelmingly positive. I almost can't believe I'm saying this, but in the areas where it actually counts, this remake surpasses the original in a number of ways that should all become apparent later. Does that mean everyone watching this should clear their schedule and buy a copy of the Masterpiece Reborn as soon as possible? Well, not quite. To repeat, this remake is very, very good, and I really mean it when I say it often improves on the original game, but the changes that have been made to it are incremental and additive, rather than transformative. That is to say, they enhance the game without fundamentally changing what it's about, and if you've recently played the original, then I can't in good conscience recommend dropping 50 or 60 of your chosen currency to play a slightly better version of it. Now I know what you're thinking, here I go again complaining about another remake when I knew exactly what I was paying for. Got slightly more than I thought I was paying for in fact. But the original game from 2005 is still perfectly playable, and more depressingly, is still better than 90% of big budget games released since, and I just can't stop myself from feeling like this endless parade of remakes and remasters is a relative waste of creative energy. With all that said, this remake of Resi 4 is still an excellent game. Please understand that none of this is to discredit the hard work that I know the developers put into it. Gripes about the current state of the games industry aside, it's about time I start breaking down the fruits of that hard work and what exactly it is that makes Resident Evil 4 and its remake such a great game. Spoilers from here. How do you design a game that will make the player feel scared? There are plenty of techniques that can be borrowed from film, like a slow building of tension and danger, sudden jump scares, or letting the audience's imagination do the work for you. In games, however, where there's an interactive element, developers have a few more options at their disposal for inspiring fear in their audience, and unlike film, they have the opportunity to make the player themselves feel like they're in peril, rather than just watching someone else in peril. Resident Evil wasn't the first game to do this by any means, and I think it's fairly common knowledge by now that it was heavily inspired by the NES game Sweet Home, but there's no denying that it's the most successful series to take a stab at the horror genre. The first Resident Evil game may contain zombies and a number of weapons you can shoot them with, but it's not a game about shooting zombies in the face. It's a game about managing resources. In fact, killing a zombie is effortless in terms of mechanics. You don't even really need to aim. But the trick is that you don't want to kill zombies, because you don't want to waste your very limited ammo. So you'll go out of your way to avoid doing so and feel a twitch of regret every time you have no choice but to use some bullets. This incentive to conserve resources is so strong that you'll likely put yourself in risky situations just to avoid using them, and if that risk goes badly for you, you'll only have yourself to blame. Choosing to put themselves in danger is a call the player has to make for themselves, and in a game with a finite number of resources, it's one with permanent consequences. Dispatching enemies isn't difficult, but you'll still dread confrontations and do everything in your power to avoid them, and even the weakest enemy becomes a real threat that needs to be taken seriously. That tension between wanting desperately to hold onto your resources, but being forced to use them to progress, is the key to early survival horror games. Every bullet fired is one you're not getting back. 9 years, and more than 9 sequels and spin-offs later, this formula was getting more than a little stale. And when Capcom released Resident Evil 4, it was a much needed shift in focus for the series. Where enemies in earlier games acted as a drain on resources, in Resi 4 they're a way of getting more resources, as they drop ammo, health and currency on death. Suddenly, the player's incentive regarding combat has completely shifted, and instead of avoiding it at all costs, it's actually a good idea to kill as many enemies as you can. This necessitated a few other changes as well. You actually do have to aim now, and your options in combat are increased exponentially. Now it really was a game about shooting zombies in the face, but the true genius of it is that it was also still a game about managing limited resources, and the interplay between these two systems leads to an insane amount of complexity, as we'll see shortly. And with that, survival horror was left in the dust, and the stage was set for Capcom to completely rewrite the rulebook, not only for horror games, but for action games too. Now that I'm about to get into the details of what makes Resident Evil 4 so good, I'm going to stick to footage of the new one because it looks better and because it's the reason I'm making this video to begin with. But keep in mind that unless I say so, the vast majority of my praise for this remake can be equally, and far more deservedly, given to the original game. So let's just jump in at the beginning. As Leon S. Kennedy, you're dropped off in a rural village in an undisclosed country somewhere in Europe, with the task of rescuing Ashley Graham, the president's daughter, from its evil residence, a crazy cult that's been infected and mutated by a genetically engineered parasite. It's about as silly a plot as you could expect for a game where you fight giants and chainsaw-wielding sackmen, but I think it strikes a good balance between being over the top and taking itself seriously, with Leon's one-liners being surprisingly effective at bringing things back down to earth.
I'll let myself out. You have a strange sense of humor.
I'm quite fond of the story and characters of Resident Evil 4, but as much as I like them, I don't consider these to be the things that make the game a masterpiece, so I won't dwell on them. As for the actual meat of the game, the combat, it starts relatively simple, but very quickly expands over the first couple of chapters into an incredibly complex beast, and new problems to overcome are constantly being introduced, even in the final stretch. As you begin with only a handgun and a knife, your options are quite limited. Landing one or two headshots will stagger an enemy and leave them open for a roundhouse kick, which will also catch other enemies and knock them to the ground, which leads to an excellent trade-off between risk and reward, where it can actually be a good idea to let several enemies get close to you at once. When it comes to the knife, an important change has been made in the remake that I think is extremely positive and makes for a great example that shows what the game is all about, but I'll get to that later because I want to go through the original mechanics before mentioning the new ones. In the iconic village square scene, you'll get access to a shotgun and grenades, and I love that this happens seamlessly in the middle of an action sequence, as enemies pour in through the windows and the most intimidating enemy you've encountered so far revs his way up the stairs. It's a panic-inducing situation to say the least, and the only proof you need that a focus on action doesn't necessarily mean a less scary game. This whole scene is tied for the one I had the most difficulty with on my first playthrough on hardcore mode, I think in large part because of the restricted options you have here so close to the start of the game. This scene is also the first chance you get to experiment with the new stealth mechanics, but again I'll get to all that in just a bit. Zooming through the rest of the first chapter, you'll come across bear traps, explosive tripwires, and dynamite throwers, all of which can be used against enemies if you're so inclined. We're only 30 minutes into the game by the way, and already there's been a hell of a lot of variety, but believe me when I say you ain't seen nothing yet. The start of the next chapter sees you introduced to the Merchant, and it's here that one of the biggest pieces of this game's complex puzzle slides into place, which means I'm finally going to explain what exactly I mean by complexity. Long story short, it all comes down to forcing the player to make trade-offs. Here's an example. At the Merchant, you can spend money to buy new weapons, upgrade ones you already have, or buy the occasional healing or crafting resource. Because money is limited, you can't buy it all, and need to prioritize what you think will be most useful to you, as well as considering what you can make room for in your finite inventory. When there's a limited resource, in this case money, with multiple possible uses, the player can't do everything and is forced to compromise and make a, say it with me, trade-off. Now when it comes to the Merchant's shop, this is pretty obvious and kind of goes without saying, but if we take a look at other parts of the game, we'll see that this trade-off principle is used pretty much everywhere, and if you ask me, that's one of the biggest reasons that Resident Evil 4 is such a groundbreaking classic. As I hope to show going forward, this deceptively simple formula is deployed in almost every part of Resident Evil 4's design, both in combat and in resource management, and by stacking and interweaving these simple systems, an astounding amount of complexity emerges. For another example, let's look at the way healing works. You can restore your health with first aid sprays, coloured herbs, fish, snakes, and chicken eggs, some of which can take up more or less space in your inventory and will heal you for different amounts. On top of the usual choice of how low to let your health get before healing, which appears in pretty much every game with a resource-limited healing system, there are a number of other trade-offs the player needs to make when carrying or using recovery items. A mixture of red and green herbs will heal you for way more, but if you add a rare yellow herb, it becomes a full heal and also increases your max health. This means that you have an incentive to keep red and green herbs in your inventory and avoid using them for healing where possible, in case you come across a yellow one. Fish heal for a bit more than other items, but take up more room, so the trade-off there is obvious. They're also usually found in groups, so when you come across a bunch of them, you usually have a choice to make about how many to take with you. Eggs heal for about the same as a green herb, but take up only a single inventory slot, so they can fit in pretty much anywhere. Finally, snakes heal for a respectable amount and take up the same amount of space as a herb, but are also necessary for a certain quest given by the merchant, so they have an additional value to the player outside of just healing. And speaking of which, if you believe that prevention is better than the cure and are confident enough that you won't be taking damage, any of these healing items can be sold to the merchant in exchange for currency, including yellow herbs which can pocket you a nice bit of change at the cost of missing a chance to expand your max health. So, as you can see, there are a lot of trade-offs and interesting decisions to be made when it comes to healing, and the ostensibly simple act of replenishing your health can become quite a complicated puzzle, where you want to maximize the amount of healing you can get now without reducing your future options too much. Once again, it comes down to a limited resource with multiple possible uses, forcing the player to compromise. Money, ammo, grenades, healing items, inventory space, every resource in this game is limited in some way, and they all have multiple uses, which means that every choice you make is a calculated trade-off. If you want to carry more weapons to give yourself more options in combat, they'll take up more inventory space and leave less room for ammo, grenades and healing. A shotgun blast can hit multiple enemies at once, but a well-placed shot with a handgun followed by a roundhouse kick might do the trick as well, leaving your more valuable shotgun ammo to be used for more powerful enemies. Same goes for flash grenades. They have an obvious utility as crowd control weapons, but because they cause an instant kill on enemies with exposed parasites, you might think twice about which situation is best to save them for. During the house standoff with Luis, letting enemies come in through the window before killing them means you can get resources from them, but obviously exposes you to more danger than killing them outside. Ammo is not only essential for dealing with enemies, but can also be used to unlock doors, disarm traps, catch fish, and retrieve treasures and collectibles. Every single bullet you fire in this game is a strategic decision to expend a certain resource to achieve a certain outcome. I could go on and on and on about all the minute trade-offs the player is forced to make, both in combat encounters and in between them, but we'd honestly be here all day, and I think I've made my point. Limited resource, multiple possible uses, forced to make a calculated trade-off. While these complex systems of trade-offs and compromises make up the foundation of Resident Evil 4's captivating gameplay, there's plenty built on top of it that prevents the player from getting too comfortable or complacent. The sheer amount of variety in this game is truly astonishing, but what really makes that variety work is the game's reliable consistency. I'm aware that sounds contradictory, so let me explain with a couple of examples. With the exception of one enemy type, throughout the entire game it's usually optimal to aim for headshots wherever possible, both because it does more damage and because it can set you up for a roundhouse kick. This is consistency. As you progress, however, you'll encounter enemies with different quirks that prevent this optimal strategy of aiming for headshots. Some have shields, some have helmets that can be shot off, some have helmets that can't be shot off, and some will guard their face by raising their weapon. This is variety, and the player has the freedom and the responsibility to find their own solutions to these new problems. In the case of the shield guys encountered in the castle, you have an incredible number of options for dealing with them. You could throw an explosive grenade to blow their shield apart, hopefully catching some other enemies in the blast zone in the process. You could use a flash grenade to stun them and kick the shield out of their hands, again hopefully catching some other enemies at the same time. If you let them get close, you can use a shotgun blast to turn their shield to splinters, or you can use a more precise weapon to take apart the shield piece by piece, or just to try and sneak in some shots on an exposed limb. Crucially, each of these options will consume a different resource, so your choices will be limited and influenced by your past decisions and by what you want to keep hold of for later. On top of all that, you'll almost never run into one of these guys on their own. They're always accompanied by other enemies, which gives you even more parameters to consider and increases the complexity even further. There's a hugely impressive amount of enemy variety throughout the game, as you'll fight all the variations of standard enemies I've mentioned already, as well as bugs that camouflage themselves, blind boys whose behaviour can be exploited to damage other enemies, parasites that latch onto a host and make them more deadly, these fucking horrible things, and a number of recurring mini-bosses like Chainsaw Man, hammer-wielding brutes, female Chainsaw Man, priests that cause parasites to burst out of other enemies, and a pig man with a gun. Again, these mini-bosses are always encountered alongside other enemies, so deliberate thought needs to go into how to most efficiently use your resources to take them down. Somewhat counterintuitively, the actual boss fights are less taxing on the player because each boss is fought in isolation and can have the player's full attention devoted to it, but they nevertheless make for enjoyable set pieces and are satisfying ways to end each act. When Ashley is rescued about a third of the way into the game, escorting and protecting her becomes yet another factor for the player to keep track of during combat, and forces them to devote more of their attention to situational awareness. There are plenty of different environments in the game, both in terms of the visuals and in the layout. While new concepts or enemies are usually introduced in the relatively safe environment of a tight corridor where there's no danger of being flanked, you'll eventually be made to fend for yourself in spiraling towers, narrow ramparts, wide open foyers, rickety cliffside settlements, a hedge maze, and so on and so on. Sometimes your goal is just to reach the other side of an area, sometimes it's to grab something and get back to where you started, and sometimes you'll need to stall for time while endless hordes of enemies pour in around you. There's enough variation in environments and enemies that throughout the game's many combat encounters, no two are ever exactly alike, which is one of the game's major successes. So yes, there's an insane amount of variety in this game, but where the consistency comes in is that despite constantly being dropped into new situations you haven't seen before, you're never in any doubt about what you're supposed to be doing. Oh yeah, and there's also a minecart level, because of course there is. The original game did come out in 2005 after all. Anyway, with all my talk about resources and the trade-offs the player has to make as they expend each one, you may have noticed that there's something I haven't fully explained yet: how the player gets more resources. This is where things get interesting. As a quick reminder, in the first Resident Evil, you get more resources by exploring and searching new rooms, and zombies are purely a drain on resources that are always best avoided. In Resident Evil 4, Capcom changed the rules so that enemies drop resources on death, which leads to a couple of theoretical problems. If we assume it was predetermined which resources each enemy would drop upon death, then a skilled player who nailed every shot and never used healing items would quickly end up with a full inventory, flush with resources, and breezing through the game. A less skilled player who made more mistakes, however, might end each encounter with slightly less resources than they started with, and would then have a harder time in the next encounter, and the next, and so on in a downward spiral of resources until they found themselves in an impossible situation. Both of these scenarios are ones that Capcom clearly wanted to avoid, and the solution that they landed on is yet another thing that makes Resident Evil 4 a truly visionary entry in the craft of game design. Simply put, the resource drops that the player gets from enemies are adaptive and algorithmically determined according to the current state of the player's health and inventory. If you're playing well and don't take a lot of damage, you might not fully take notice of the fact that the game skews enemy drops in your favour, but if you make several mistakes in a row and use up all your recovery items, it won't be long before an enemy drops a green herb to get you healed up. Likewise, once you become aware of this, it's hard not to notice that enemies will only ever drop ammo for the guns you happen to be carrying. Very convenient. It's no accident that the other method of getting resources is from containers that need to be broken open, which means that their contents can be hidden until they're determined by that same algorithm. There's still an element of chance involved that prevents total predictability, as you'll discover if you have to try a sequence multiple times and get different resources from the same container, but the percentages are influenced by your current health and inventory. What makes this adaptive system such an innovative bit of design is that it lowers the skill floor while also still incentivizing skilled players to be sparing with ammo and healing, because a full health bar and inventory means it's more likely that enemies will drop money, which is always going to be useful long term for upgrading your gear. Another feature that was new to the series in 2005 was the use of checkpoints over a manual save system, and when combined with resource management mechanics, this can occasionally lead to some unfortunate unintended consequences. If the player makes a mistake like wasting a grenade or some vital ammo or just taking damage they think they could have avoided, they might find themselves in a situation where they would prefer to die on purpose to go back to a checkpoint and try again with their resources back, rather than playing on through their mistake. This is an issue by no means restricted to this game, and you could argue that it's on the player to avoid resorting to such scummy tactics, but any system that requires self-policing on the part of the player is a system with room for improvement. Amazingly, the forward-thinking design of Resident Evil 4 even mitigates this problem somewhat, which is especially impressive considering there are games that release today that don't address the issue. It turns out that the solution is actually quite simple. The game keeps you slightly overstocked with resources, so that if you make a blunder and waste some, it's not the end of the world and you'll be able to play on through your mistake without feeling like you've just blown your chances of success. While these adaptive resource mechanics are safeguards that do an incredible job at preserving the game's forward momentum, it's hard to deny that they do lead to a reduced emphasis on resource management compared to the previous games. But in the name of doing something new, I think the right call was made here. Fittingly enough, Capcom would have faced something of a trade-off to make for themselves when designing Resident Evil 4, between the resource-focused mechanics of the earlier games and the tendency towards action they were intent on adding to the series. While leaning towards the latter meant reducing the importance of the former, they managed to hit a perfect sweet spot between those two elements, and as you're probably aware, they were never quite able to recapture that spark with the following sequels. So, to quickly summarise my thoughts on the ingenious, industry-shifting design of Resident Evil 4, it's a game all about making trade-offs, where every decision you make is a calculated one with the potential to influence every future decision available to you. By now you've probably got a feel for just how complex this game really is, and the building blocks that make up that complexity. Let me just repeat that everything I've mentioned so far are all innovations from the original way back in 2005. So hopefully I've gone some way towards explaining why it was such a groundbreaking, revolutionary experience. As I promised in the intro though, this remake actually pulls off the admirable feat of adding even more complexity to the gameplay, so I'd like to spend some time praising those positive changes, starting with the combat knife. In the original, when an enemy was knocked to the floor, it was effortless to get some free hits in with the knife because the knife was unlimited and it didn't cost any kind of resource to do so. It was one of the few sources of free damage in that game, and as such it was obviously a dominant strategy to do it, leading to a lot of the game looking very similar as you relied on the same tactic over and over again to save on ammo. I'd go as far as to say that this was a pretty major flaw in the original game's otherwise extremely well balanced design. In the remake, the knife now has a durability meter, which means that every swipe costs you something, and when that meter empties, the knife breaks and can't be used. This is a brilliant change because it removes that dominant strategy that was present in the original, and in fact I barely used the knife that way at all during my playthrough. This is because the knife, or I should say knives, actually have multiple different uses in the remake, all of which drain the durability. They can be used to craft ammo for a certain weapon, can be used for an instant stealth kill, can stop a defeated enemy from mutating and resurrecting, can parry melee attacks, and at the cost of a big chunk of durability, they can be used to quickly escape a grab and save you some health. All of these alternative uses seemed much more valuable to me than wasting the durability on random slashing, so I didn't do it, and that was a strategic decision I made for myself. Once again, we can see the trade-off principle at work. By making the knife a limited resource and giving it multiple possible uses, the player has to make trade-offs and choose what to prioritize. The crafting system is also a positive inclusion, as it means you may have resources taking up space in your inventory that aren't directly useful to you, but might be useful in the future if you find the other relevant materials, leading to another classic trade-off. And the fact that every crafting material has multiple possible uses should go without saying at this point. Stealth is another new addition that I think deserves a few words. At first it might seem antithetical to the Resident Evil 4 design ethos, but in practice it has a very limited utility and is able to sit on top of the mechanics of the original without replacing or invalidating them. You can usually only take out one or two enemies before being spotted, and because it consumes resources in the way of knife durability, it's not an overpowered or dominant strategy by any means. The backtracking side quests given by the merchant are another good addition that give you the choice of using a bunch of resources to take down an optional but powerful enemy, thereby potentially making your next encounter more difficult in exchange for a second currency that can be used to buy special items. Treasures can now have multiple types of gems inserted in them to increase their sale value, rather than only accepting specific collectibles as in the original, which means that you now have actual decisions to make when it comes to selling treasures. All of these additions are minor and don't change the game in a hugely significant way, but they do increase the complexity by giving the player even more decisions to make and trade-offs to consider, which is a brilliant way to build on the original game while still remaining true to its essence. Unfortunately, not every change made for the remake moves the complexity slider in the same direction. Healing has been changed a little by the fact that Ashley no longer has an independent health bar, so no longer represents a possible use for your recovery items. By reducing the number of possible uses for healing items, this is a change that actually reduces the complexity compared to the original when it comes to healing, and you're all but guaranteed to max out Leon's health bar and have useless yellow herbs clogging your inventory by the end of the game, whereas in the original you had the option of using them to expand Ashley's health. It seems obvious enough that this choice was made to make managing Ashley less of a hassle, as a concession to those who complained about her in the original game, but something was definitely lost in the change. When a once valuable resource becomes worth less to the player, I think that's a sign there's an imbalance in the resource economy. The addition of a storage box at typewriters is another change that reduces complexity by negating the limit on inventory space. When you can store healing items there to be retrieved and used later, or worse, teleport guns there from anywhere to immediately free up inventory space with no downside, the whole point of inventory management goes out the window. Carrying a lot of healing items in your inventory is good insurance against future damage you may take, but it comes at the cost of taking up space that could be used by something else. By allowing you to store those healing items externally, the remake lets you have that insurance without any kind of associated trade-off, which is a negative change as far as I'm concerned. Lastly, I want to mention a couple of changes that I think are mostly neutral. The new bolt thrower weapon is an interesting concept, but I'm not quite sure it works in execution. The idea is that the bolts for this weapon can only be crafted and can't be found as item drops, but they can be retrieved from enemies once they're killed, so there's sort of a risk-reward thing going on. If you miss your target and there isn't a wall or some surface behind them to catch the bolt, you'll lose it. The thing is, the thrower takes so long to arm and reload that it's just not practical for use against groups of enemies, so I only ever pulled it out to pick off the final straggler. There's definitely something to this concept, but I don't think it fully works as it is now, and I mostly used it as free damage at the end of an encounter, similar to how the knife could be used in the original. The addition of briefcase charms as rewards from the shooting range is mostly harmless, given that a certain amount of chance is already involved in item drops. Slightly modifying the percentage chance of getting certain items is hardly going to make or break your playthrough, but there was one less than ideal instance where I realised I could get more health back from a fish by running back to a typewriter and changing my charms for one that increases health recovery from fish, which was obviously a huge waste of my time, but in the name of playing efficiently, I couldn't stop myself from doing it. And that's about it for gameplay. Some areas throughout the game have been remixed by having you come at them from a different direction, which is a great twist that cleverly brings out the best of both worlds. You get a pang of nostalgia on seeing the familiar space, but also get the satisfaction of overcoming a new challenge. A few small changes have been made to the story and characters, but I don't have any problem with that, and I'm happy to view this remake as a reimagining of an old tale. Likewise, certain missing scenes like the cable car and trap rooms in the castle don't bother me because there's more than enough variety here already, and as I said at the beginning, the original holds up incredibly well and is still easily playable today. However, what does bother me is that almost 20 years after the release of Resident Evil 4, Capcom, and the rest of the AAA games industry, seems unable to move on from that heyday when designers were actually coming up with new ideas and pushing the limits of what was possible. If you'd asked the average player back in 2005 whether the march of technological progress would lead to better and better games over time, I have no doubt their answer would have been yes, but it seems increasingly apparent that we've been sold a lie. Games today may be pushing more polygons, but in terms of design principles, the needle has barely moved in 2 decades. Yes, this remake is a great game, and yes, I got a lot of enjoyment out of it, but it's a great game because this 20-year-old original was an innovative, revolutionary, genuinely new game. By definition, this remake cannot possibly be called innovative, unless you consider releasing on time and without bugs to be an innovation, which given the current sorry state of AAA games you just might. From a business perspective, of course, I realise why this is happening. Imagine spending 4 or 5 years of your life working on something new as part of a team of hundreds, and when it's finally finished, it flops and is instantly forgotten. While the individual artists and developers involved can and should still be proud of their personal contributions, now imagine that you're the CEO of the company that funded that game, looking at the black hole you tossed your budget into and knowing that you're going to have to answer some very difficult questions from your shareholders tomorrow. It's no wonder that Capcom would rather take the safe bet of re-releasing a game that they can guarantee will sell millions of copies on day one. To reuse a prediction from a previous video, when they run out of Resident Evil games to remake, Dead Rising will be next, mark my words. As it is now, AAA game development is an unsustainable bubble waiting to pop, and if you ask me, the sooner the better, for everyone involved. I would really love to end this video on a more positive note, but this ongoing trend of taking the safe bet of nostalgia over experimenting with something new doesn't exactly fill me with excitement for the future of gaming. Still, if there's a silver lining to this endless rehashing, then it's that developers have proven that they do, at the very least, know what makes a good game. With any luck, sometime down the line they might actually release a new one.